councillors won't be aware, but the issue of Kenaway Farm has come up at our community board because, as I understand it, the developer wanted us to put yellow lines around the road so that they didn't have to comply with, and they've applied for a consent not to do the traffic upgrades that they were supposed to do if they have a certain amount of the site developed, which was basically taking away a separated median and providing a pedestrian cyclist area around the river. So I just wanted staff to in very simple terms, help me understand what changes we're making in terms of Plan Change 28, and I know we've been given this copy. So can you just try and help me understand what this is doing in terms of their requirements for development in this area, and whether it's going to make it easier for them to get out of doing what the conditions of their plan change were.
If I can take you to page 29 of the chapter. Page 29, 16.2.5.1.5, non-complying activities. That rule there reflects the same rule that came from Plan Change 28, which is the very issue that has come to our attention and to the community board's attention through recent proposals by the developer. Now, this rule here essentially provides the trigger for resource consent, but because it's a non-complying activity, it does set a high threshold for anyone to breach that standard. So I understand that in the application. Having said that, an application has been already made for resource consent, which will be assessed against the current city plan. So whilst this rule reflects the current city plan, we can't necessarily influence through changes to the draft industrial chapter what assessment's made of that application. There's no other changes that would affect their likelihood of a non-compliance by being approved by resource consent than what the current city plan allows.
So we'll move on to cookie time.
Just final plan to refer to in the package of maps, map 5. Map 5 is the outline development plan for cookie time, and just the key issue that was raised at a public meeting we had in Templeton and also in writing has been the interface between industry and residential. And today, Cookie Time have plans to expand their factory in the future to meet growth, but they're arguably a good neighbour to date in respect of their business and want to stay there, want to stay in Christchurch, but also want to maintain the relationship with their neighbours. So they're proposing a range of measures to avoid impacts on those neighbours, including, amongst other things, setbacks, landscaping, noise mitigation by use of acoustic fencing. But in addition to that, through the feedback that's been received, they've decided there's 2 points of access from Trents Road into the site, one inward, one outward. And the outward point of access, as you can see on the ODP, looks awfully close to the residential properties to the north. And so Cookie Time have agreed to move any future access point to the south of that at least 25 metres from the residential boundary to at least remove the risk of noise effects as well as other impacts of traffic. And so effectively there's been some change to the ODP to address that issue. So in my mind, that's a positive outcome from what would otherwise have occurred. So just finally, on area-specific issues, Islington Park, which is also known as Waterloo Business Park, there's been amongst other comments made on this area, there's been comments that have sought provision for preschools, for gymnasiums, and for commercial services such as a copy centre or a bank. And that's to recognise that the area is in the order of 120 hectares and that there should be some supporting services. And so what we've done is proposed that in the Islington Park and other general industrial zones, we don't provide them for them as permitted, but assess each one on its merits as a restricted discretionary activity, and then in the heavy industrial zone, make it full discretionary, given that there's a greater risk of reverse sensitivity. So we're acknowledging that those uses may be suitable, but we don't want to provide for them as of right. So it's sorry. Oh, sorry, a cafe is permitted as of right, but in terms of preschool, gymnasium, bank, we want to still assess those uses. Great. Moving on to the general issues. The first is really about we've already discussed this first issue, which is restrictions on retail and office development in industrial zones. And there's been a concern about offices being restricted and their activity status. And a key message has been that the nature of office activity that's associated with an industrial company is different from an office that wants to locate in a commercial centre or the central city. And we've, as discussed earlier, recognised the policy context that we need to provide industrial land for industry. Notwithstanding that, there's generally speaking not going to be a demand to develop large offices if that land's required by an industrial company. So they'll only develop offices as an ancillary function or secondary function. And we've had discussions with a company that owns 2 large industrial areas in the city, and there's a memo in the package that came to you which has a couple of blue lines through it and yellow lines, so it's a one-pager. And this is just an example, but it shows that the proportion of offices in relative to warehousing on industrial sites in this area, in these 2 areas, one being...
Do people have this? Sorry. Can people find it? Yes. Okay.
Sorry. Sorry,
okay.
I was jumping ahead.
Sorry. Carry on. Have you got it, Yanni? Yep.
Yep. Yes. Just taking this as an example, the first table details the floor space in Glassworks Industrial Estate, which is off Shands Road, and is quite a new development off Shands Road. It's south of the Carmen Road, south of the main South Road intersection. If you're heading south on Shands Road, it's on the left-hand side. And you might be familiar with seeing Carter Holt Harvey and Fisher and Paykel on the site. And what this shows is that there's a range of needs that industrial companies have for offices, and the proportions vary. But New Zealand Safety and Downers, for instance, have a relatively large office component relative to their warehouse, whilst others, generally speaking, have a much lower proportion. And it comes back to drawing that line of ensuring that office doesn't become the predominant activity. And so in drawing a line and saying, if you cross that line, you need resource consent, we can assess the scale of that office activity. And so what we're proposing is that the maximum threshold for offices in an industrial zone is rather than what was in the draft, which is 250 square metres or 25%, whichever is the lesser, we propose to increase that maximum limit on offices in industrial zones to 500 square metres or 30%, whichever is the lesser. And to explain the impact that would have, for instance, in Glassworks, it would capture all the ones that aren't highlighted in blue and yellow. And the reason for it's obviously not just in response to this, but it's to recognise that offices do still have an important component in industrial zones, but again, we don't want it to become the predominant use. And the reason that we have both a percentage and a square metre threshold is that for instance, Carter Holt Harvey have an office of 1,300 square metres, which whilst it's only 6% of their total floor space, 1,300 square metres is still a large scale in the context of the city. So we the thresholds are set to enable that assessment on a case-by-case basis if it exceeds those limits. So the approach we're taking going forward is to take a restrictive approach to offices, but still recognise and allow for those offices that actually function as offices secondary to an industrial activity. So the draft rule that we went out for consultation with was 250 square metres or 25%, whichever's the lower, and we're increasing that to 500 square metres or 30%. Oh, sorry. In the operative plan, a number of industrial zones, there's no limit whatsoever. So areas such as Wairaki Road have, if you've driven up there recently, there's a number of office buildings going up, and that's because there's no limit in, someone that owns an industrial site could tomorrow decide to knock it down and develop it as an office building. And so the risk of that is that we lose that demand that would otherwise go to commercial centres and
For the city.
and for the city. There's a separate memo that I've circulated to you, which I won't go into detail on, but it outlines the office demand for office floor space across the city, and I'll let you read that at leisure. But the key message is that industrial is for primarily industrial use, and we want to direct the office and retail sectors to go back to the central city and to go back to commercial centres once their time comes that they have to relocate. So.
Over 25% these two, New Zealand Safety and the donors, that's not comply with the district plan.
They're lawfully established now, so they wouldn't need to now apply for resource consent under the new plan, but any future proposal such as what is on the ground that New Zealand Safety would need to apply for resource consent to enable that assessment. Now, it could be the outcome that proposal, given New Zealand Safety still has a predominant use of the land as industry or warehousing, it may be appropriate and that consent's granted, but we want to ensure that a line is drawn and we make an assessment. If we don't have a line as we've got in the current city plan, yes, there's no limit at all, then you run the risk that these industrial areas don't become industrial at all.
Okay, thank you.
Allowed to do anything to being allowed to have 500 square metres or 30%, whichever
That's
is the lesser.
correct. Yep. And I would say that comes directly from the RPS and the LERP in the discussion that we had previously about offices and the Tate site. That's where the direction comes from, to keep industrial land primarily for industrial purposes, which is a big change of direction from the operative plan.
I should point out, across those two industrial areas, we're providing for all but 3 of those industrial companies if they were to apply for to be assessed against the proposed plan. And so we're still meeting that, providing for that demand, and by shifting the thresholds, we've responded to that feedback. But it's to avoid other potential developers who see an opportunity to develop an industrial estate for an office park, for instance. So many years ago, for instance, parts of Addington, Show Place, for instance, was historically an industrial zone and is still in the current city plan, yet has become an office park. And the greatest opportunities out there are arguably where the land is cheapest and they can make the greatest gain financially. So we need to draw a line and take a restrictive approach and say, if you want to go bigger, then we want to make that assessment. We're not saying no to everything. We're just over that threshold, but we just want to be able to assess what the effects of that will be on other locations. And the risk of not having a line at all, as is in the current plan, is that the central city won't recover, and our commercial centres that have been damaged and we've done a lot of master planning work for won't recover. So
it's really about scale. It's allowing for a level of office activity that will benefit, or that is necessary for these industrial activities to occur, but where the scale is simply for office use, we would prefer them to relocate back into KACs or the central city. We have had discussions with the Property Council about this, Madam Chair, and they are agreed to the principle that, yes, headquarter offices, large offices should go back into KACs in the city centre. They're not looking for that kind of opportunity, but they do want us to recognise that some of these types of industry do require more office space than others, and hence the increase from 250 to 500 square metres or 30%.
Placemaker, even they are 13.1 percentage, but they still more than the 250 square meter, am I right? 358. You take a 439.
So placemakers would comply with the rule that we're now proposing. Under the draft that we put out for consultation, they wouldn't have complied because they're over 250, but because we're increasing the threshold, it would provide for placemakers. So that would be permitted as of right. I should add, in terms of placemakers, we do provide for what we call yard-based retailers and trade suppliers in the industrial general zone as a permitted activity. So the likes of Bunnings and Mitre 10 and yard-based retailers such as car sales yards or even second-hand goods outlets like Turner's car auctions, we permit those in our industrial zones because they're the most suitable locations amongst other areas.
So how did the Property Council view the price effect of this?
In what respect?
Well, obviously, if you're required to establish your office in the central city at perhaps 400 a square metre versus out in the southwest at maybe 120 a square metre, the
But
price
this
quite
is what we're allowing for, Madam Chair, is to make sure that the businesses that are locating in industrial zones, as of right, for example, are able to achieve the office space that they need. That this would fall within the 30% ratio or the 500 square metres. What they've agreed, though, is any head offices or offices that are not associated directly with the industry, they agree should relocate back to KACs or the city centre. We're not telling them to locate their small amount of office that's needed directly related to their industrial business to relocate. That's what this rule is doing. It's allowing them to have that.
Well, no, the current plan allows you to have unlimited office space in the...
Yes.
Yep. This plan allows
It restricts it, that's correct, because
restricts
we
it
have to be
dramatically.
consistent with the RPS and LURP,
the RPS being,
the regional policy statement,
which
says that we need to keep industrial land primarily for industrial purposes. And if you like, my colleague here can find it for you. But I also mentioned that the LURP talks about not using industrial land for higher value purposes, i.e. office blocks.
In terms of that supporting the chapters, the Section 32 analysis, and we need to consider the benefits and costs of what we propose. And whilst there's a value associated with what the market terms price points and so forth, which is what land's sold for or leased for, we also need to consider the impacts of the costs implications for the wider community. And there's other costs that aren't necessarily reflected in market costs. So there's large amounts of investment put into infrastructure in our commercial centres, for instance, public transport. And if that's not fully utilised, then arguably there's a lost cost to the community of that investment in infrastructure. And also that there's, if we allow for offices and industrial zones, for instance, there's a greater cost to the community of people travelling further to access offices that would otherwise be accessible by public transport, which runs through our centres. So there's, it's broader than just the cost that the Property Council and business will indicate to us.
So I can understand what you're trying to do, and I have a lot of sympathy with that. But the ones that I'm concerned about are the ones that had recent plan changes, who are now having quite a dramatic change. And when I look through the list, there's the one that comes to mind is Plan Change 58, which was done towards the end of 2012, in 98 Wrights Road. So have you considered that, there's some areas that have only just been rezoned, that you're going to have quite major impacts on because of the fact that, you know, they only just realised what they could do with the land, and now they're being told, actually, we've got a whole bunch of different plans for you.
Yeah, certainly that's an issue. The difficulty is that if we start making exceptions for those that have recently been through a process, then you start to weaken that position that we're trying to achieve of directing officers to the locations we want them. If we allow for officers in the Wrights Road location because they've been through a recent plan change, or it opens us up for challenge. Perhaps Brent can add to this, but the risk is that there's not a resource management reason as such for permitting officers in Wrights Road and not somewhere else.
No, but I guess from a legal, I don't know, but from a moral point of view, someone's spent a whole bunch of money getting a plan change. Whether you agree with the plan change or not, I mean, I don't even think I supported this one, but they've got the plan change in on a basis of what they can do. Less than a year later, we're coming in and saying, or a year and a half later, we're completely changing it quite dramatically. I would have thought that that's quite a unique situation, as opposed to people that have had the land for a long period of time, who, you know, have kind of had the opportunity to develop it, haven't developed it, you know, and now we notify and now suddenly say, oh, well, that's not fair to me.
Madam Chair, through you, perhaps I can respond on the legal aspect of that. The RMA requires there to be a district plan review every 10 years, so anyone who applies for a private plan change request knows that it's going to go through a district plan review within the next 10 years. That's the first point. The second one is that the plan change request will have been assessed under the statutory instruments that existed at the time, and they've changed. So since they went through that plan change process, we've now got new provisions in the RPS, and we've got the land use recovery plan. So it is a different legal environment within which we're assessing the appropriateness, or the council is assessing the appropriateness of the plan provisions for a piece of land.
For this particular site, it could be, you could have said it should be commercial. Why haven't you done that?
Its current use is still, I understand, part of the raceway, and they haven't advanced their proposals to physical works on the ground. So there's no basis to zone it commercial, having regard to the level of public transport accessibility, the context of where it sits. It's beside a raceway where there's a significant amount of traffic, and so there's potentially traffic effects of locating a new commercial centre there. And also, as part of the commercial strategy, we've gone about assessing the future growth of retail, the future demand for retail floor space, and what is required to serve the future communities of that area. And whilst we are planning a new commercial centre in the North Horswell Greenfield area, there's considered to be sufficient retail provision in that area to serve the residents' needs. So effectively, there's not a need for a new centre in that location, which is what a commercial zoning would provide for.
What actually happens, that's raceway land that they've developed, all those, like where Enable is and everything around Wrights Road. What happens to that now?
That parcel of land that got rezoned a couple of years ago, their zoning would be subject to this proposed draft chapter going through the process. The rules would, as amended in this draft chapter, replace anything that's in the city plan in respect of that site.
Once any appeals are finalised.
So are they intending to build more? Because they're obviously, it's made a huge difference to their finances, I know. But are they intending to build more developments along there? Because they're doing it in conjunction with somebody else.
They could well be. I don't have their feedback.
So are we actually taking the rug from under them, basically?
They could well have proposals for an office development of sorts, but it comes back to what distinguishes this site, and if we make an exception for them, then we run the risk of undermining our defence of the restrictive approach we're taking to industrial areas across the city.
So Wrights Road is stuffed now in terms of traffic flow. If you ever go down Wrights Road, it's not a good experience. But there are major offices on the back end of the raceway. Are we actually just ripping this out from them? Have they got any more planned? Do we know?
I couldn't tell you. I'm not aware of their plans at the moment for the site, but
Absolutely, through you, Madam Chair, they can apply for a certificate of compliance, they can put in their resource consent application now, but they have the right to protect their position, knowing that this plan change is underway. Yeah.
We could get some feedback for them, but that's exactly why we have had the 5 weeks of community engagement and specific stakeholders and what have you.
that they have provided feedback, and I can follow up by reviewing their letter, which may have more details about, but from memory, I can't recall what they're proposing.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Correct, Madam Chair, and I wouldn't consider it appropriate for the territorial authority to change what it's proposing for a plan change when people do have those rights protected under the legislation.
I did give you a list of private plan changes back at our last round of URCAL workshops. Right. Might want to look at those. I can't remember them off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
And in the package of documents accompanying the draft industrial chapter, there's an A3 document that has all the recent plan changes and the rules that have come through those plan changes and what's proposed to change. The document is headed Overview of Changes in the Draft Commercial and Industrial Chapters from Operative Private Plan Changes to the City Plan and Rationale for any change. That's a mouthful, but there are other areas that have been rezoned through plan changes that do enable offices as of without any restriction. But in the same way that a landowner might have recently purchased a block of land in an area that hasn't been subject to the plan to a plan change, they could argue that hypothetically I've recently purchased a block of land with the intention to develop it for offices, but
Be really annoyed about this. Apart from Addington Raceway.
Can you speak? I mean, people might be annoyed, but if they've got their plan change, they need to do something with it. They can submit their consents applications, and they have up until these rules become. I don't have that information at the top of my head, but that list of private plan changes that we gave you, which, I can give it to you again on Monday or Tuesday when we next meet.
the provisions obviously affect those that have been through recent plan changes, but they affect any landowner with industrial zone land, and arguably there'll be landowners who perceive this as an adverse outcome because they lose the right to develop their land for offices, but there'll be others that see it as a positive effect because they've got an existing industrial use and they know that there's greater certainty of the uses that will go around them, and there's arguably also going to be an impact on land values for those. There's industrial companies that could be well paying a higher premium for their land because it enables offices at the moment, and if a restrictive approach is taken, then potentially there could be a lower land value which will benefit industrial companies in those areas. So there'll be those that benefit as well as those that don't, but we need to make sound resource management decisions based on the effects rather than necessarily an individual's impacts.
I really appreciate that, but this seems to be being made somewhat after the horse has bolted. So we've got these numbers for the central city. The development that's happened in Addington and elsewhere has meant huge office developments outside of the central city. And so post that fact, we're now kind of closing the door, but all the horses are down the track, is what I'm worried about.
Madam Chair, we are planning for a 40 or 45-year timeframe though. We are looking a long way into the future. So yes, there has been office development in industrial areas, but the question for the territorial authority through this plan change process is what's appropriate for the future.
And office blocks that are there have existing use rights. This is not retrospective.